So hi, I'm Leslie Hershberger, and I'm on the IEA board and editor of the 9 Points Bulletin. And the 9 Points is our online news magazine that's all things Enneagram for our global community. And so you're going to be able to find this interview on 9points.org. So I'm very excited about our guest here. It's TJ Dawe. And TJ Dawe is a writer, performer, and director out of Vancouver, Canada. And I should say an award-winning writer, performer, director. And he's going to be the Endnote for our conference. And I am really excited because I've been following TJ's work, and TJ's a fellow integral person. And I've just been following some of his work, and he's does a lot with the Enneagram. And I'm going to let him talk a little bit about that. His shows include One Woman, Sex and the City, parody on love, friendship, and shoes, and Burn Job, Post Secret, the show. And he does pop culture parody shows and then also biographical monologues. And so I'd like to welcome my guest, TJ Dawe. Thanks.
Hello.
TJ.
Happy to be here.
So I feel like I gave a little overview of your work, but I'd rather hear it from you. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, you bet. I went to theater school to study to be an auditioning actor, which didn't quite fit. I discovered along the lines that I liked saying my own lines and telling my own stories. And then I started discovering the work of people who created their own stuff. And then that's what I started doing, and I've been doing that ever since. So I've got two main threads in my career now. One is pop culture parodies, like One Woman, Sex and the City. I also co-created a one-man Star Wars show, or one-man Lord of the Rings. We're working on one-man Stranger Things. I just directed a 5-person musical parody of Game of Thrones. So there's shows like that.
Wow, that's ambitious.
Yeah.
How do you do when you talk about, when you think of any of those shows, there's this huge scope, right? So talk a little bit about the one-man version of that.
Well, it's a matter of seeing what you can condense down into just its most essential elements. And if it's one person doing it, because that's the other thread of my career. One is the pop culture parodies. The other is autobiographical monologues. That's me standing on stage telling stories about my life. These are the jobs I've had. These are the relationships I've had. Or more recently, these are the critical incidences which brought me to a place of growth and understanding where I worked through pain. If it's not clear already, I identify as a 4 quite strongly. So I tell stories about myself. And one of the things that helped me identify as a 4 is in the wisdom of the Enneagram. It said 4s often gravitate to an artistic medium that gives them 100% artistic control. One-person shows.
Yeah.
Leaving being an ensemble actor and becoming a person who stands on stage and just tells their own story. So I've got a very talented friend by the name of Charlie Ross, and that's where these pop culture parody shows started. He and I created the one-man Star Wars trilogy, and that was a matter of me seeing that he just had this world-class, and I'm not exaggerating here, world-class ability to do voices and pantomime and sound effects. And he didn't need costume changes or props or technical support. He, by himself, could be on stage and just be every character in the Star Wars trilogy, as well as the creatures and the spaceships and the sound effects. And he's still touring that show. He's paying a mortgage and raising a family, making his living by running around the world being Star Wars on stage by himself. So part of that was a matter of seeing him and his talents and fostering that. And part of it's just the practicality. We were in our 20s at the time and didn't have many resources. So it's a lot cheaper to have a show with one person than a show with 12 people. It's easier to tour. It's just easier to organize, all of those things. So there was my inclination towards solo performance that I kind of had as a 4 anyway. And then my understanding of his stuff and just the practicality of it's just easier to tour a small scale show like that. The Game of Thrones show is a much bigger operation, so there's a lot more moving pieces. And I'm starting to expand myself beyond just the confines of what I'd restricted myself to before, starting to slowly understand that, I can work with other people. I can collaborate. Yeah. And that's a big part of what the Enneagram did for me. I was working on my own, doing my own thing on my own terms for a very long time. I discovered the Enneagram in my early 30s. And it was through the self-exploration that the Enneagram invited me to do that I started understanding that the sense of alienation that I felt was largely my own projection. That it wasn't a law of nature that the theater community had nothing to offer me or rejected me or disdained me or anything like that. Right. That was me. Yeah. And I've since come to understand that it doesn't have to be like that. And when I'm kind of telling my story that's going like that, then I can stop and see, okay, am I really being excluded or is this just me? And that has allowed me to open myself up and play with others.
I almost think of, yeah, I'm thinking of like, I'm trained in a school where we talk a lot about the inner observer, and it feels like it's almost a way with your show. It's almost a way of getting a little space around you and your type structure.
Yeah.
And diving into that and seeing how it unfolds.
Yeah. So just looking at what are my patterns? What are the things that come up again and again? And the older I get, the more clear the patterns are. And then there are always surprises. Right. If I go to a workshop or a retreat or have an experience or discover something like the Enneagram, I've done 3 different autobiographical monologues that involve the Enneagram.
Interesting.
Because it's just been such a catalyst for growth and understanding for me.
So with the biographical monologue, so this is different than, say, the One Woman Sex in the City. So these are more the pop culture parody line of work.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the biographical monologues.
Yeah, so I did a show in 2010 called Lucky 9. Mm-hmm. And Lucky 9 was about my discovery of the Enneagram. Yeah. And in that show, I've got a monologue where I describe all 9 types. And it's about a few other things, but it's not just about discovering the Enneagram. I tell stories about how the Enneagram allowed me to have conversations with my mother and sister that I'd never had before. And then touring the world, or at least, North America with that show, fostered a lot of conversations with audience members, most of which had never heard of the Enneagram. And then that allowed me to just have that as a conversation subject when I was doing festivals and just be around people more and have in-depth conversations with people more. And then that kind of kicked me into using that more in my creative process when I'm working with other people. I work with people one-on-one a lot on taking their ideas and stories and turning them into something on stage. And I usually introduce the Enneagram into that process because usually what I find most interesting about a person's story is who are they deep down? What means the most to them? When did they find out who they are? What is their growth? What are their shadows? So the Enneagram is a hugely valuable tool for that.
Yeah.
It's also really valuable in directing in terms of if I want someone to play a different character, like in this Game of Thrones musical, it was very valuable because you had 5 actors playing dozens of characters. So this character, and I literally would use this to direct sometimes, if somebody had the vocabulary, I'd say, can you make this character have more of a 2 energy?
Okay.
They're not so much attracted to that person. They just really want their love.
Okay.
And then that would change that person's demeanor and energy.
So it's almost like, putting on, sometimes the somatic teachers will teach this. It's almost like putting on the type, almost.
Yeah.
The suit of a 2. What does that feel like? How do they stand? How would they walk? How you might come in? And I would think that would be a whole way of engendering some sort of understanding, compassion, connection to that type as you embody it on stage.
Exactly. What's the world like through the lens of this energy? Because many of us go through life thinking like everybody experiences the world the way I do. Of course they do.
Yeah.
And a lot of actors play the same kind of character again and again and again, or they make every character like themselves, as opposed to, maybe there's motivations that are radically different from my own. Mm. Maybe there's ways of carrying my body or perceiving the world that I could try on and see if that fits what this needs right now.
So TJ, I've watched a couple of your YouTube videos and I've seen, some of them is comedy. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of the Enneagram? Do you, for you, talk a little bit about the show itself, comedy, drama, a little bit of both, and, how does that play itself out in terms of how you approach the types? Like, I'm so intrigued by this.
About which show in particular?
About the 9, I guess you did one that was a 9.
Lucky 9, yeah.
Lucky 9, yeah.
Yeah, there was that show, and then I also did a show called Marathon, which was about the instincts.
About the instincts. Oh, really?
Yeah, so I'm a riso-hudson student, and the Part 3 training is largely about the instincts, not exclusively. But that really blew my mind. Like learning about the instincts in depth and learning how the instincts are just as vital a bit of the understanding of the puzzle as the types themselves, if not more.
I couldn't agree with you more. Yeah.
Yeah. So I did a show that was in large part about, here's how I discovered the instincts. Here's what the instincts are. Here's how I applied that to my life. Here's how I tried to overcome my instinctual stacking and then came to understand that it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And the name of the show is Marathon.
So can you give an example of what a character might say, in the show, in the marathon show?
Well, that's an autobiographical one, so there are no characters. That's just me
Okay.
talking about my own experience.
Okay.
So I would sometimes vamp as somebody who's got self-pres as their top instinct, like to illustrate that. And I'd do a bit basically about packing for a trip and doing all kinds of research as to, where am I going to get a good kind of coffee, but I'm still going to bring my French press and my own beans anyway, just in case. And, I'd really go on and on with it. And I knew I was doing it right when I could see people in the audience either doing this, we're doing this.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what it's like. Yeah, that's what I think. My husband and I travel a lot. It's like, yeah.
Yeah. And the instincts are so fundamental.
Yeah.
And, when trying to get across the Enneagram, logically, most people start with the types, but there are 9 types.
Yeah.
The instincts, there's only 3.
Yeah.
And so it just takes that much less time to describe. And I found people would resonate with them so strongly. So just like with Lucky 9, many people would approach me after the show and want to have a conversation about it.
Yeah.
And would say that it helped them understand, oh, this is why my husband and I argue so much, or this is why, my group of friends drives me crazy, or that kind of thing.
Yeah. So given all this, what do you plan on doing for the Endnote in July?
Well, a big subject of fascination of mine has always been arts and pop culture. Like growing up, some of the pivotal experiences of my life were watching movies, reading comic books, watching TV shows.
What were some of your favorites?
Star Wars. Like I saw Star Wars in the theaters at age 4. And when those words Star Wars blasted off into space, that was the moment for me. And I still experience that. Yeah. And Star Wars was largely, or at least in part, inspired by the works of Joseph Campbell. It's got deep roots in mythology. Right. And it wasn't until my college years when I started reading Joseph Campbell that I really started to understand that. And his basic theory is that mythology is kind of a projection of our inner energies, our spiritual identity and roles in the world. So in my adulthood, I've kind of returned to a lot of that stuff. I rejected it for a while in my 20s, as an alienated 4. I don't like that stuff anymore. If people like it, it's bad. And then I came back to it, thanks to the Enneagram. Yeah. Oh, yeah. One of my favorite writers once said, the masses are always wrong. And I took that as a big validation.
What a profound statement.
Yeah. And then came all the way back and, realized I never really lost my love of Star Wars. And I co-created a parody show of it. So one of the things I'd like to talk about in my talk is going to be exactly that. How the patterns that we see in pop culture are updated versions of mythology. How popular movies and comic books and fantastical tales in general reflect our inner energies. They're mostly morality plays. When you come right down to it, a given Marvel comic or Hunger Games story can be boiled down to simply a person trying to figure out how to be good, trying to figure out how to do the right thing and how to use the abilities they have to make the world a better place. And
when you see these pop culture, you see these stories, and Lord of the Rings is the big one in my house.
Right. Yeah.
And, it strikes me how often my husband talks about the different characters in that story and is applying it in our lives, whatever's coming up for us.
Yeah.
This is that time in our lives, Les, and
right.
we reference a certain scene.
And that's why these stories resonate. And that's why Tolkien, who is not a professional novelist in his career, wrote this series of books that just took over the world. Because when someone hits the bullseye, it speaks to something deep inside people. And we don't necessarily know why we're so fascinated with it, but it comes up again and again. We think about it a lot. So an idea that I had, and I also wrote a one-man show about this 10 years ago, it was called Totem Figures. The premise of that show is if each of us had our own Mount Rushmore, or our own totem pole, or our own Sgt. Pepper's album cover that described our lives, who or what would be on it. So it could be family members, it could be mythological characters, it could be pop culture figures, it could be famous artists, it could be jobs we've had or identities we've had, anything and everything that kind of shows this is what I value, this is what I've done, these are the pivotal experiences of my life, or these are the characters or the artists or the people that I come back to again and again and again because they speak to something deep down inside of me.
Yeah.
And how that relates to the Enneagram is that we can spot all 9 types in characters from popular culture if we look. And that's something many people who are interested in the Enneagram do, is they'll type fictional people.
Yeah.
So I plan to do a little bit of that with some fantastical characters, and then ultimately look at, like, within a mythological analogy and framework, who are we as students and as teachers of the Enneagram, and what does that entail?
Yeah. So say more about that, that within a mythological frame. Can you give an example?
Yeah, well, on the one hand, on these are just a regular mundane level, we're just people living our lives, and we drive to work, and we pay our taxes, and we watch TV. But on the other hand, we are people who are not entirely different from our ancestors 100 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, or 10 or 50 or 100,000 years ago. So something I just like to think of quite a bit is, what is the ancient equivalent of what I do now as an artist or as a teacher? And what are ancient patterns that are similar to what I'm going through now, whether it's in my personal life or my professional life with a given friendship, or what are ancient versions of what's happening politically or socially in the world right now, or in America.
TJ, have you ever seen that quote? You see it on social media, come up every once in a while. I want to say is it Socrates talking about kind of the youth today?
Yeah, right, exactly.
And you read about the youth today and what he says about the youth today, and then you look and you see that was Socrates, and it's like,
right.
Wow. And it's
the kids these days, it's all going to hell.
Right. These kids today, where it's that passage where you get to a certain age in your life and you look back at the young, whatever's emerging, and you think, oh man, we're going to hell in a handbasket here.
Right.
That impulse that's inside people as we age.
Yeah. So how many things that we're doing are kind of carbon copies of things our ancestors have done or said or thought?
Right. What about music? Do you see all this? Do you see this as in music as much as you do? You talk about pop culture? Yeah.
Absolutely. Music hits us right on an emotional level. It's not unusual for someone not to know the lyrics of some of their favorite songs, or apart from like a few key lyrics, because it just hits us in a certain place and makes us feel a certain way. And music is vibration and can have a visceral effect on the cells of our body.
It's funny because I think I'm with my husband because of music. I mean, seriously. And what was interesting, he's a body type and I'm a head type. And he doesn't know the words of the songs. He just remembers the beat and the boom, whatever the
right.
And I know all the words.
Right.
And we've remarked on that. I can't tell you how often it happens. Because I'll say, isn't that just like, and I'll start describing it. And he said, I don't even know what they're saying.
Different things are going to resonate with different people.
Yeah. But it's the same song we're connecting over. That's what's so interesting.
Right. It's like different facets of a jewel.
Yeah. So, well, this has been great. My frustration is I would like to talk to you longer. And this is really more of a short interview, 9 points. So I would really love it if you could point me to some videos because I think I want to share them on our IEA Facebook page.
Yeah, you bet.
Yeah, that I can share with people so they can get to know you. And then, I asked you before we started if you would write for our 9 Points magazine and just talk to us a little bit about this. Because here's the thing, what I love about what you do, it's not as much of there's certainly a place for teaching about the Enneagram. And a lot of the Enneagram community is really, really focused on the centers, which has been really, really helpful for people, and embodiment. And the body has really come online in the past few years. What I like about your application is that it's this lived experience where you're looking for the patterns and the things that sometimes, that we can apply Enneagram language, but it's like the people are connecting to that. And I don't know, there's something about it for me where I feel a certain sort of like, that these types are there, they're in our culture, they're in music, and we're learning about ourselves through media and music, and you're weaving these two together. And for those of us who are interested in both, being to understand that weave, it's kind of cool.
Yeah, I've always seen pop culture as a window into who we really are. Or not just pop culture, culture in general.
Right.
I guess that's what kind of sent me towards the arts and has resulted in me creating a career as an artist. That's where I see the light. That's where I see the eternal.
I had lunch yesterday with someone. He's actually a 4, and he's a marketing director of a theater here in Cincinnati. And he talked about that. He talked about how he's involved in a leadership group where he talks about creativity, where somebody will say, why do we need creativity? Why do we need to fund the arts? And he talks about, and for someone, as a heart type, that this is where it touches us here. And right. I would argue that it touches us in all three centers, but it is a portal of entry where it opens us in some way to the, that felt experience.
Yeah, and ultimately to the eternal and the divine.
Yes.
As well as just on a much more everyday level, just to greater happiness and satisfaction. I think if most of us were practicing creatively on a regular basis, we'd spend a lot less time on the internet.
Yes.
Either distracting ourselves or arguing or being frustrated.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like you're moving some of that stuff through the creative process is what you're
we're processing what we go through and we're finding the meaning in even the most mundane events in our lives.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. Well, I thank you. I really appreciated this conversation, TJ. Is there anything else
to
say before we go?
I can't wait to have a longer conversation at the conference
with
you and with everyone.
Okay. Thanks, TJ.